Well, I'm Shari Pfleeger. I'm the research director of the I3P. I'm the temporary co-chair also to try to relieve Martin of some of his overload. And we asked Tony, let me welcome you again on behalf of all the I3P staff. We asked Tony to start us out with a description of the threat because we thought it would help remind us all, I know we all know a lot about the threat already, but remind us with a big picture of just how vast and complex the threat is. So, because we think that will be a nice introduction to the next part of our presentation, which is we invited several people who have been involved with the I3P in various ways to come and talk about how the I3P affected them, their careers, their way of thinking. So to introduce their discussion, I put together with the help of Luann, actually she did the hard work, Luann Goldrich from Johns Hopkins, APL. We asked Kyle, where's Kyle? There he is in the back. Kyle put together I3P documents from each of the years that the I3P has been in existence. And then Luann built word clouds. If you don't know what they are, it'll be obvious as soon as I show you the first one. Word clouds over the 10-year period, and it helps us to see just how the focus of the I3P has changed and grown over the years. So what the word clouds do is I'll show you the first one, it'll be pretty clear. This is from our documents from 2003. The words are bigger when they appear more often in the documents. So the biggest word there is research. That's what the I3P's mission was at the beginning. I was lucky enough to get involved with the I3P at its start. I was at the RAND Corporation, and we facilitated a series of meetings where the I3P's initial mission was to help put together a research agenda for cybersecurity for the nation. So RAND hosted 11 different meetings for 11 different business sectors where security people from each business sector came and talked about what they would like to see on a national research agenda. So you can see enterprise, research, systems, cyber, those are the big words in 2003. By 2004, we've started to broaden our scope. So we have SCADA systems. We had, for several years, what we called a SCADA project. It eventually, the follow-on project was called Process Control Systems to give a better sense of what that meant. We became more of a consortium. We looked more at interacting with the government and infrastructure. 2005, we started doing work with the oil and gas sector. That's why the word oil is right there over the 2005. We started looking at things like terrorism. You see process control growing in 2005 down at the bottom there. 2006, we started investigating risk, and the word business gets better because we started our economics project, which I had the privilege of leading, and we started looking at how business manages cyber risk along with all their other risks. And a lot of people in this room were on that project. Yakov was on that project. And so you can see investment, business, industry, company, those are the words that are starting to be big in our word cloud. 2007, the word user starts to get bigger. This is where we started looking at how humans interact with the things in cyberspace. And we started things like our behavioral science-related projects, reflecting more and more the multidisciplinary nature of the I3P. Here's some other words. In 2008, we started looking at privacy. We started looking at messages, credentials. It was around this time that we were finishing up our insider threat project. And we started looking at networks, and we started looking at identity management. So you see kind of on its side the word identity, just to the right of the 2008. So this also, as you can see more words and more large words, you can see our portfolio has gotten bigger over time. 2009, there's the word user right in the middle and the biggest word. So here's, we were doing our privacy project, we were doing a human behavior project. We also you start seeing the word model getting bigger here. We started developing models to help guide people in making decisions. 2010, you start looking at encryption, algorithms, ciphers, adversary information, and the word game is starting to get bigger. In some of our projects, we started developing games to try to tease out how people make decisions about cybersecurity. 2011, again, the word user is still big, the word privacy is big. We started looking at requirements. We started looking at software design. And we also started looking at things that were in a larger network context. And finally, this year, we're doing all sorts of research, as you'll hear more about in a little while. We're doing all sorts of research looking at cybersecurity in the larger business context and more about things like information sharing. You see the word under user is sharing. We have a project on information sharing. You see more of the word policy showing up. And again, the number of words in this one is probably 2 or 3 times as big as the initial slide. So our portfolio of projects has grown. Our list of sponsors has grown and is continuing to grow. And to give you an idea of how our impact has grown and how the appeal of our multidisciplinary nature has grown, this morning I briefed our newest project on incident response teams. And one of the things that the sponsor said about that project was that the topic was given to DHS by the US CERT. And when they saw our proposal, it was pointed out as the one that they wanted to fund because we brought to bear organizational psychology, the business perspective, and the technical perspective in a way that exactly hit on what DHS was looking for. So I think over the 10 years, not only have we expanded our portfolio, but we've gotten better at learning what our sponsors need and trying to address it with the various levels and disciplines of expertise of our 28 members. So with that, I'd like to give each of our speakers a few minutes. We'll start with Sal Stolfo and we'll work our way across, and each one will come up here and talk about the role of the I3P in his or her career.
I'm not sure I have much of a career. So Mr. Stramella mentioned, was it ComSec and NetSec and InfoSec? But the most important message was JobSec. I was involved with the I3P, and I respect the I3P, and for many, many years I've been very, very thankful for being involved with them. They did a number of things, not just the research. The research is always important. The funding and so forth is very important. It was the collaborations that was the biggest lesson. It's protection of infrastructure, but fundamentally the infrastructure we have to protect it from people. And so the insider problem was one of the major projects of that time that lasted a few years. And through that project, computer scientists, social scientists, different schools ordinarily wouldn't communicate much with each other, like Columbia and Cornell got together. And the results were very substantive. Just for my particular part of that project, we produced a number of students, theses, papers, typical thing that academics measure, including patents and companies, but also 2 companies was spawned from all that work. But also the follow-on work by different agencies. NSA has been funding the insider stuff forever, but DARPA had 2 follow-on projects. Just this morning I learned DHS has 2 insider projects. It's a perennial problem. I think the insider problem is probably the oldest problem. I think it dates back to Adam and Eve, but I'm not sure which one of them has the patent on it. But what we did in particular, which I found really fascinating listening to this presentation, it amazes me every time I hear the same kind of discussion. The use of deception by the bad guys can be countered by the use of deception by the good guys. And this is what was one of the results of the Insider Project. The work that I've been doing with my group is scalable deception. So that when a bad guy breaks in, spearfishes you, you give information, There's everything that's available is the real deal, is the real information, and they just abscond with it and done. But instead, if we can put them into a virtual, deceptive world, because this is, after all, an artificial world we construct, they won't know what's real and what's not. And deception has been used as a defensive strategy, as I said, going back to Adam and Eve. And this is a result directly from discussions with the various research groups in the I3P. So that's just one little taste of one of the projects. The integration of different disciplines working together. This is what this kind of an organization represents. Not just the hard problems everybody's working on, but bringing people together to come up with some, what I consider to be novel and important solutions. So my 2 minutes are up. Anybody else? If you want to ask a question or so about deception, I will definitely lie.
So I'd like to thank the I3P for inviting me to this event, as it's been a great pleasure to work with you in the past, and I'm certainly honored to be sharing the podium with such a talented group of researchers. My affiliation with the I3P has been mostly through the SCADA and later the PCS survivability and recovery project, where we sort of took on a fairly ambitious goal. So we wanted, on one hand, to improve the safety and security of the SCADA and process control systems today by developing a number of tools that help manage configurations, that help do intrusion detection, that help provide this kind of situational awareness that was sort of sorely missing from that space. We also work to develop tools to improve the security of the future process control systems by putting things into the pipeline, by teaching people to write secure code, by enabling them to use better architectures and do things in sort of a fundamentally more secure way. And finally, our third goal was to create this framework by which they could relate sort of their mission and their business interests to the investment in cybersecurity. Now, the world was sort of different back then. I3P, as usual, was sort of at the forefront of the wave of research on SCADA security. And in the first couple of workshops, we sort of fairly quickly found out that we don't have a lot of traction. We're not speaking the same language. And so one of the things that I took away from that project is sort of the nimbleness with which the I3P team responded and sort of refocused and changed the scope a little bit, expanded it more like, to educate and raise awareness on the issue in order for us to be able to have the kind of conversation that we needed to have. And so by engaging in the workshops with the industry and by engaging and participating on standards boards, this was sort of, I think, a very important piece that the I3P did, and that really led to a lasting impact of the work that we were doing. Sort of for my own turn, I vividly remember sort of a year out of college flying down to Austin to meet with one of our industry participants. And in addition to talking about what I wanted to talk about, I spent a good hour and a half giving them a crash course in computer security and explaining things that I sort of took for granted as people understood, buffer overflows are bad, and these things are a bad idea, and default passwords on systems are a bad idea. But nonetheless, that kind of thing had to be done, and I thought it served well. So things have sort of changed. As you saw from the threat briefing, things are moving, and the threat is larger. There's certainly more groups and more funding working and aimed at securing the process control systems and working in that space. There are more companies and more tools, a few of them based on sort of the ideas that came out of the I3P project, if not directly the technology itself. And finally, it's sort of nice to see that for the new emerging technologies, the smart grid, cybersecurity is sort of an issue that's being considered at the beginning, and that's really kind of the way that it should be. So there are plenty of problems that remain. We can't really call everything solved, pat ourselves on the back and go home. So in particular, with the move to the cloud, the issues of privacy and enabling controlled information sharing, the issues of data provenance and trustworthiness that were brought up in the talk in the keynote, and the issue of the user aspects of insiders, of usable security, are certainly still there and are far, far from being solved. And from that, I think that the I3P offers a unique solution by bringing together a really extraordinary team of very talented people from multiple disciplines. I think the I3P understands the value of the public-private partnership and working with the industry and identifying the right stakeholders and understanding their motivations and not sort of working on technology solutions sort of in this closed environment, but instead understanding the context. And finally, having the capability and frankly being willing to educate and train people in understanding why these issues matter. And I think I3P is very well positioned to have another wonderful 10 years, and probably more than that. Thank you.
So I started with I3P pretty early, and I liked the timing. Timing is something about I3P's beginning that I think hasn't been brought forward very well. I mean, when they say they started around 2000, I see two people in here that were doing some things that were very important in 2000. Tom wrote probably one of the first articles on economics of security, and Angela, you know, she pretty much founded Usable Security. And I thought that Tony's keynote brought forward so much of where we used to be. You know, if he were still here, I would say to him, you are so down on your girls. You know, they're doing something very hard. They're growing up to be young women. And we don't design cars so that you have to be a rocket scientist not to be blown up in them. But we certainly do design computers so that you pretty much have to be Tony to be able to use them effectively. And you know, he talked a lot about, you know, users. Well, we all know that joke that there are only two industries that call their customers users. Okay? So I want to say something more. I mean, the IEEE had a tremendous impact on me. I got me much more involved in DC, and in part because of my work with the IEEE, I ended up being also an IEEE congressional fellow, and I spent a year on the Hill, and that's when I dropped out of any, you know, formal relationship for the I3P, and Kelly Kane picked it up at Indiana University, and I hope you get Clemson involved too. But as it was starting, issues of economics of security were just beginning. There was the first workshop in 2001. And I think your first paper on trust was in 1999, right? Is that right, Angela? And yeah, no, I'm giving it away. We're old. The focus on human behavior and business, the I3P brought people together in a very critical way. And you can say, you know, the I's could be interdisciplinary investigation instead of infrastructure and information, because that's a huge part of what they did. So there was, you know, Tom was working in Pittsburgh. You've moved out since, haven't you? Yeah, me too. But, and I was in Massachusetts, and Ross Anderson was just getting interested in Cambridge. And the I3P was able to bring such a broad group of disciplines and people together that we would have just had, you know, one paper over here on economics of security and one paper over here, and then maybe eventually behavioral economics of security would come forward. And that was what was really part of the human behavior insider threat, that the I3P brought out the human behavior component, that people are trying to get other things done. So maybe, you know, despite their father's very public encouragement of their intellect, one of his kids might grow up to be a brain surgeon. And if she does, do you want her to spend a lot of time thinking about configuring her computer? Or do you want it just to work so she can think about brain surgery? Right? And I3P has brought together the people to make a difference. Oh, where's my minute person? Am I okay? Okay. So about a third of the people in this room are also at a DHS principal investigators meeting. And the DHS principal investigator, the BAA, really brought forward for the first time outside of I3P this kind of integrative approach to security. And I do not think BAA 1102, and I've been talking to contracting and learned way more about government numbers than I ever wanted to in my life. would have ever existed without I3P. I genuinely believe that. And if you look at the list of things that it has now in 2012 of we recognize these are critical issues, they're integrated. There was an explicit economics of security call from the Department of Homeland Defense. Said we have got to take economics seriously if we want to secure the network. There are 4 large-scale, multi-institution, usable security grants that go over 3 years. I've forgotten, maybe a dozen companies that are, and out of all of those, there'll be technology transfer, there'll be code. And I think that the people that founded the I3P, you can step back and say, this probably would not have been without our integrative work. So I think that the I3P has certainly had an effect on me. They funded me. We graduated PhD students. But they've also had a tremendous effect on the discipline and the interdisciplines that surround it as a whole. So I have my 2 minutes, the other thing, is that Dartmouth also, if you look at this, Dartmouth co-hosted, and they hosted the Economics of Information Security. They hosted the first Insider Threat Workshop at Duke, right? That was the very first open, targeted workshop at Duke. I3P has taken ideas that people either thought were marginal, like, oh yeah, well, economics, yeah, they're over there, those guys, they're the only people weirder than the theoretical cryptographers. And, psychiatrists, well, I mean, look, you don't need to talk to my psychiatrist. And brought them into the mainstream. And they did that not just through timing, but through the people involved. And I just want to kind of turn this around and say thank you to the people who founded it. And there's one other area in which the I3P didn't necessarily ask me, but I think they've made a big difference by bringing these people together, is in curriculum. So I went to Indiana University. We designed an explicitly interdisciplinary curriculum in security. There are a dozen courses now in economics of information security, and almost all of those, to my knowledge, everyone who's teaching those courses has, either been to Dartmouth or been supported by the I3P. And as you look, and Denise and Kelly, I can see you're developing psychology of computer security courses. Would that have happened without the I3P? So the I3P, yes, has had an effect on me. But when they started, you can ask any. Imagine me going up to Tony and saying, your daughters aren't stupid. It's your engineers that are stupid because of the way they are designing the systems, because the computer knows perfectly well you've never been to that website before. It's just not telling her, right? And that was not an easy sell, and I'm sure I could have made it easier if I'd have been nicer about it. But the I3P really brought these 2 areas together, human behavior in the insider threat, by beginning with the insider threat, and I think that you've changed the academy. Thanks.
Good afternoon. Well, first I'd like to thank the organizing committee for asking me to speak this afternoon. It really is a privilege and honor to be here in front of you talking. And I kind of want to take a step back and talk a little bit more about a personal aspect of how I feel I3P has influenced me. And I started my involvement in around 2007 as a PhD student. I was at the University of Tulsa. I was working with Dr. Shinoy at the time. And I was very fortunate that he got me involved with I3P very early on. And my research specifically focused on critical infrastructure protection. And I got involved with the process control project at the time. And it was nice that we had the consortium. We had top universities, we had national labs, we had some of the organizations as well working together on that. And one of the things I thought was very interesting about that part was the actual tech transfer. And a couple folks have mentioned it, but it's more than just the research that kind of stays in the box, but it's actually taking the ideas and the efforts that the community brings together and develops, and then actually transferring them over into usable assets for the nation's security. And I think one of the other aspects, though, I was fortunate to be involved in the project, not only from a research standpoint, but more importantly, to work with some of the leaders in the cybersecurity field. And as a PhD student at the time, I'm sitting at a table having discussions with the people that are writing the textbooks that I'm using in my class to study. And you know, that proved helpful sometimes during finals week. And Shari, thanks for the information on the crypto contract signing protocol that came in handy for Dr. Shinoi's test. But from that standpoint, but I think this aspect's really important to highlight is the actual community that it brings together, not necessarily the institutions, which are important. We have some great institutions that are involved in I3P, but it's really the people behind it and the people that come from that institution and just the great leaders in this community that I3P brings together. And so I was fortunate to travel in 2010 with Heather and Dr. Shinoi to Norway. We spoke with the Norwegian governing body on their deep water oil drilling, and we were able to provide some insight as well and help them develop policies that we had derived through I3P and some of our processes and things that have come out of the various conferences and research that we've brought together. And that was one thing that I was very interested in, and it kind of speaks to the international body more than just the national as well. The fact that they recommended that or recognized some of the aspects that I3P has been involved with and asked us to come over there and present our work. And kind of moving on with that, so once I graduated from Tulsa, I am an active duty officer in the Air Force. I've got about 17 years in now, but I transitioned to the Air Force Institute of Technology, where I'm a professor there of computer science. And really the background and the people and the connections I met through I3P is I still stay close to today, and I still carry that with me. And I truly believe that I wouldn't be where I am today without kind of these relationships and the experience that I gained while participating with the I3P organization. And to kind of emphasize that point, I'm going to kind of leave you with an anecdote, I guess, you know, of something that happened, I guess, to me. So last June, I was set to deploy to Afghanistan, and as a military member, we raise our right arm, you know, and we agreed to do that. At the time, I was involved in some research and really wasn't excited about going just because I didn't want to have to stop that research. But I got a call right before I was supposed to deploy, and my deployment had gotten turned off because someone had made a call and said, hey, there's a directive coming up. We're not going to let you deploy. You need to go work on this project. So, of course, I said, okay. And basically what they needed a technical advisor that brought it together some of the academic standpoints to look at cyber-physical systems and evaluation of cyber-physical systems. And so some of my work with I3P was recognized through that, as well as the fact that I'm a professor at AF, it didn't hurt. But so I got called into that, and I spent about 8 weeks in an undisclosed location developing a assessment methodology that we could use for these cyber-physical systems. And unfortunately, one of my good friends and colleagues, Lieutenant Colonel Dave Robinson, who's at Dartmouth, and he worked with Dr. Savenko students, he's now downrange in Afghanistan, where I should be. So again, I3P, there really is a reason I'm here, right? So it could have gone a different way, I guess. But so I3P prepared me for this role. And so when the project ended, we were able to deliver the report ahead of time. And it's one of the most amazing things in my 17-year career I worked on was that project in and of itself. And so I took a student with me and was able to, her work and our report was directly passed on to the individual that had requested the project. And we actually delivered the project on time. The direct report went to him. And I'm not sure if he's actually had time to read the report yet because he's been out working on his re-election campaign for his second presidential term. And so it was really neat to have the President Obama actually pull this project together to have us work together on it. And our findings went up directly to President Obama and Secretary Panetta for actually this process we came with. So maybe a little aside kind of from I3P, but really it was the notion of the connections I made at I3P, the folks I've met there, the wonderful people I was able to work with that kind of built this up for me and an experience I carry with me, and I'm a proud supporter of I3P, and I'm very proud to have been a part of it for the time I was, especially at the University of Tulsa. So again, thank you, Shari, for the invite here, and Heather and Nicole, again, thank you as always for coordinating and taking care of the things. So with that, thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Bruce Bakis from the MITRE Corporation. I also want to thank the I3P for the invitation today. I really appreciate it, and it really is an honor to have a talk with you. And like Jonathan, one of the things I'm really going to try to do is to get a little personal in terms of the experience and my relationship with the I3P and how it's affected me, as well as a small sphere of other folks at MITRE's that were involved in the digital identity research activity that we saw on Shari's word cloud. As it started to really pop up, this research activity went from 2007 to 2009. And we can see that sort of starting to emerge in terms of digital identity, in terms of the word cloud. There were 6 organizations, in addition to MITRE being involved in this research activity: Cornell, Georgia Tech, Purdue, SRI, and the University of Illinois, and a number of those folks are really back here in the room again today, so that's really great to see everybody. It was in about early 2007, I got an email from a colleague showing me essentially a draft research proposal and wondered if I would take a look at it. I had done a lot of work with Homeland Security, and specifically the Transportation Security Administration, on privacy. And someone said, would you take a look at this and see what you think? Are you interested in getting involved? How would you change this proposal? And I was intrigued and interested and said, this might be a fun thing, but I didn't know anything about sort of essentially the organization that was organizing it, the I3P, didn't know anything about it, but it looked interesting. So I said, sure, I'll do some work. And my initial involvement was just as a basic researcher. And I was doing a lot of, I'd have to say, stakeholder engagement within the New England region, talking to a lot of organizations, trying to find out really what are some of the greatest challenges they had in terms of managing digital identities. I mean, so I talked to healthcare organizations, financial services organizations, actual identity providers. And so I was able to actually, so it was a variety of stakeholders, and among them were some interesting characters. There was an individual that was recommended. He was from the MIT Media Lab, Dazza Greenwood, and he's a pretty widely sort of recognized expert in digital identity. And another relationship that was established was with Fidelity and Alex Popovich there. And what's interesting is I just mentioned those two only because this was back in 2007. And so there's been actually an enduring set of relationships that were established as a result of this stakeholder engagement. And so that's probably one of the first, I'd say, sort of impacts of value propositions of the I3P, is the ability to sort of provide the platform or the framework to establish these kinds of enduring relationships. And that's very powerful and very valuable. I'd say, so as I sort of continued on as a basic researcher, I started to show up at some of the meetings. And the first I3P meeting that I went to was in 2007 in September at West Point. And it was there at that meeting that Martha Austin was introduced as the new executive director, and this new guy was Charles Palmer was introduced as essentially as the research director. And so over the course of those few days, again, this being my first meeting, I mean, really, I got a sense of really what the I3P was and who I was working with. So it was the first face-to-face collaboration with the researchers from the organizations that I mentioned, and it was the first exposure to this very powerful, very effective leadership of the I3P. And I started to come away from that thinking, there's really something to this. The next meeting I went to was a program review, and my wife accompanied me, and it was in December of 2007, and the meeting was in Miami. So this is another one of the, I'd say, the value propositions of the I3P. These guys know how to host good meetings. So we go to the right places, the right time of year. So what we were doing at that meeting, again, it was a program review, and I was, again, participating as just a basic researcher, and really starting to get more intrigued, better knowledge of really the I3P and of the organizations that we were working with. And on that trip, my wife accompanied me, and she had the opportunity to meet a number of the staff from the I3P, among them Heather, Martha, and a few others that have sort of moved along. And one of the things she was struck by was, she said to me afterwards, she said, these are really good people. You've got to really make sure you sort of stay connected with them. So let's just hang on to that theme for just a minute, because it's going to come back in just a short while. So that's another one of, I'd say, the very impactful things about the I3P. They're really good people. So now we're sort of moving along from a timeline perspective, and it's now early 2008, and there was a change at MITRE that necessitated us swapping out the existing principal investigator and moving somebody else into that position. And a number of people said, would you like to do that? And I can't tell you how many times I said no. I mean, at least 5 or more times. Someone said, well, yeah, you want to take over, it was Michelle Moody at the time, do you want to take over Michelle's role? No. So this went on for really quite a while, until all of a sudden I got a telephone call, and it was Charles Palmer. So we had a nice long talk, and at the end of that, I mean, I just couldn't say no, so I said yes. So here we go. So here's another one of the impactful things about the I3P. They're very influential, and they're very persuasive. So in addition, so now this is a completely different role for me, as sort of I'm not the basic researcher. I'm now sort of helping to direct not only what really MITRE's doing, but trying to help steer the research group as a whole, and trying to figure out sort of how stitch together some it's very interesting and related types of research, but trying to unite it along the same type of path. And so that was a new role and a great learning experience for me. And so one of the great things then, that another one of the sort of impact statements is that there are these very powerful and productive relationships that you're able to form within the I3P. And we've heard that from a number of people, but that was really my experience with it. And as it turns out, that those relationships can, again, with the enduring theme, they continue to be leveraged, because we tapped a number of the folks that were on that as we worked on a proposal for NISTIC, the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. We sort of called up the old crowd and said, would you help us out with this proposal? And so those relationships really continue, and those were very, very powerful. If people talk about, sort of the products that are created from research, and really how do you measure the impact? We talk about papers, number of papers, and things like that. And there were just 2 things that MITRE was really focused on within this research activity. One was developing a set of web services that we call Trust Hub, to take a look at the interoperability issues in terms of identity federations within a healthcare environment. And the other thing we worked on was a trust framework, and that actually resulted in a paper that was presented at the ID Trust 2009 conference. And so and this Trust Hub web services, we deployed as an open source set of software. And so just before this meeting, I decided, let me just take a look and see what's going on within each of those sources. And I was actually very surprised to see that within the last 12 months, that there were 34 downloads of this trust framework paper that we had presented at the conference. And there were also more than a dozen downloads of this Trust Hub software. So that's another one of the, I'd say, the areas of impact, is the I3P as a platform or an engine for really moving materials, doing tech transfer, and moving them into the public domain. And we can see the effect of that years after the research activities end. So now finally getting really down to the people and getting a little bit more personal. And I talked about this small sphere of researchers. One of the researchers within MITRE was Jaya Tripathi, and she had actually come to the activity out of the software development environment within MITRE. She was a software developer, and so she knew a lot about web services. So she started to get involved in this research activity and learned a lot about digital identity and about healthcare. And so what it actually did for her was it actually completely changed her career at MITRE. She transferred out of the software development organization and went into sort of a project type of organization within our environment. And she started writing research proposals. MITRE has a very robust research program. And first she was involved as a researcher in several different activities. And now she's a principal investigator, and she's leveraging all of the work she did developing these set of services. So years after we complete an activity, we see really how it's affected sort of the career of somebody at MITRE. There were a number of other folks. I mentioned Dazza Greenwood, and I've continued a relationship with him along the way. And he continues to work with MITRE in a consulting capacity, and he's, again, what his work with us on the digital identity research activity did for him was it really exposed him to the sort of I'll call it the healthcare scenario, or the healthcare environment, where he thought about protecting digital identities in that environment. Prior to that, he was thinking of different kinds of environments, and so it sharpened his focus, and it helped him develop a framework that he now talks about in terms of making sure that there's business, legal, and technology issues that are all addressed. Another one of the individuals I mentioned was Alex Popovich from Fidelity, and it turns out I now see him very routinely because we're both involved in another organization that's called the Advanced Cybersecurity Center, or ACSC. And then finally, there's me. So I talked about really how I started off as a basic researcher, and then I ended up as the principal investigator. And along with that came the sort of the mantle of being the associate representative to the I3P from MITRE. And so that really amped up the sort of, I'd say, my involvement, responsibility. And it was really a great part of really my own personal growth. But what was interesting was that, again, the Advanced Cybersecurity Center, ACSC, that MITRE was involved in as we're trying to help sort of get this going, that we needed somebody at MITRE to focus a little bit more attention on that. And so people at MITRE started to think about, well, who could help us do that? So they said, you know that guy, Bakis, he kind of works in this I3P, sort of this collaborative organization, multidisciplinary, cross-domain. That's just the kind of guy we need to sort of help us with the ACSC. So that moved me into now this realm of helping to develop this organization. So I'm on the steering committee there. And then as a result of that, there were sort of other residual things that happened. So there were a couple degrees of freedom away from the I3P directly, but it's clearly I've been influenced and affected. And now I sort of represent the I3P on the executive committee, and so that sort of culminates really the story of impact. So in terms of really summarizing really the impact of the I3P, the ability to establish these enduring external relationships is extremely powerful and effective. They do great trips, and they're really great people. And I also mentioned that they're very, very influential and very persuasive. Also at the same time, I talked about really these productive relationships that were established with the research team itself. And again, I mentioned a number of them here right now, and that's part of the great value proposition, is getting to work with really just the top cyber researchers in the nation is really a great benefit. And then we talked a little bit about the impact of really the I3P providing a platform for technology transfer, and it really helps fulfill, I think, part of the mission, which is to really operate in the public interest. And then finally, we just talked about really the ability to affect careers, so it has this very enduring impact. So that's really how the I3P has affected me over the past several years, and I believe the relationship will continue, and it's greatly valuable to me. So thank you.
So I was an I3P fellow from 2007 to 2009, and I want to describe a little bit of the impact that I3P had on me personally. I came to the University of Virginia to pursue studying risk analysis of engineered systems. I was following one of the fathers of risk analysis, Jakob Hames, and when I first arrived, in 2002, he and one of his colleagues, Barry Horowitz, were starting to talk about the institution of this consortium, this group of experts around the country who are going to study cybersecurity, information assurance topics. And although it seemed a little bit detached from my original interests, they really pulled me in when they started working on a project related to the security of control systems at oil and gas refineries. My bachelor's degree was in chemical engineering. My work had been for Honeywell in process controls. And I remember one of these early experiences as we were sitting around a conference call trying to decide on what the problem really was. Sandia decided that we were going to hold this conference in Houston where we would actually ask and find out what the real problem was. So we organized this 2-day conference. We went out to Houston. We had representatives there from the oil and gas industry, from the vendors of these automation products, from the government who had cybersecurity interests, and from these hackers who made a living doing ethical hacking, going over to networks and trying to figure out how to get into them and providing reports on what their vulnerabilities were. So we used a risk elicitation methodology that was developed by Professor Hames, and split these people into 4 groups: the hackers, the owners and operators of oil and gas systems, the vendors of automation systems, and these government stakeholders. And we elicited from them a taxonomy. What does the threat space look like? What are you doing about it? What are your interests? And expecting that we would come about the same risk taxonomy, but from these 4 different perspectives. And it turns out that they overlapped, these 4 perspectives on the exact same problem. The risk to oil and gas process control systems, they overlapped by about 10%. And we started recognizing some really interesting problems that people hadn't recognized before. For example, the owners and operators claimed that they didn't have access to secured, usable automation systems. The vendors claimed that there was no demand for secured, usable process control systems. And we recognized that, that there was this recreation of what Nobel laureate George Akerlof called the information asymmetry, where if you can't articulate the impact of a system on the current and future value of your product, your mission, your business, then there's going to be underinvestment in that. People are going to are only going to purchase low quality products, and the market's not going to clear. So you're going to end up with this space where there's all these people that think they demand it, but because you can't measure it, they end up buying something that's much undervalued. And this really built my understanding of the role of risk analysis. My research was not in cybersecurity; it was in the cascading impacts. If there's a perturbation to a certain critical infrastructure sector, how does it cascade across other connected infrastructure sectors? And during this time with the I3P, I was able to meet Professor Zimmerman from New York University, who was doing this research, meet some of the key players from Sandia National Labs who were building models that the government was mandating. And all of this as before I even finished my PhD in systems engineering. Shortly after I completed, Professor Hames asked me to stay as a research faculty at the University of Virginia, and encouraged me to continue to be involved with the I3P, and suggested that I apply for one of these postdoctoral fellowships, that a program that they were just beginning to instantiate. And my work at the time was with the Commonwealth of Virginia, helping them to establish a critical infrastructure protection program, helping them to establish response organization teams. And so it seemed like a key feature that had been missing from the cybersecurity picture of these of emergency response physical emergency response to natural disasters and industrial accidents, was an ability to secure an incident through digital identities, and to make sure that you were able to give access to the right people who had the right skill sets in the right amount of time, but in a way that you're still securing the perimeter and not allowing the people that shouldn't be have access to these accidents to have access. And so HSPD 12, which was a directive kind of establishing some objectives for a digital identity program across the federal government, FIPS 201, which was a standard for how we can actually accomplish some of these digital identity objectives, had just come out. And the Commonwealth of Virginia, the state of Maryland, DC really needed some help implementing this. And so I submitted this proposal, which was accepted. And it gave me this chance to work with the state of Virginia. And I just, as a kind of a boasting statistic, they instituted this thing called the First Responder Authentication Credential, the FRAC. And the Commonwealth of Virginia issued more FIPS 201 compliant FRAC cards, HSPD 12 identities, around 2008 than the entire U.S. civilian federal government had. They had been able to establish how they were going to adapt the trust models of the firefighters and the hospitals and the communications workers. They had established a process for producing these credentials, and were able to get these things out so that there would be what they called the short line with all the people that had these digital identities, and the long line, which is everyone else that somehow wants to have access to these disaster sites. One of the pivotal moments for me in my career was attending, as an I3P fellow, I was invited to attend all of these quarterly meetings of the I3P. And I remember one of these meetings was in Ithaca, New York, in the fall. The leaves were orange and golden, and we were meeting at Cornell University. And I remember someone came up and talked about how they were framing this experiment to understand if we can detect on a network human behavior when they're looking for certain kinds of information that they shouldn't be looking for. And I was amazed that we could set up such experiments and that we would be able to actually gain some insight through this. I met some of the people who wrote the textbooks for data modeling. We had presentations about how to start standardizing and measuring the impact of cybersecurity on current and future value of missions and businesses. These responses to this threat and risk that we had understood from a couple years before, and I was able to start to relate to and hear from and learn from all of these great minds who are thinking and collaborating and developing solutions to these problems that were beyond what any individual researcher or any individual institution could do. And by the end of my I3P fellowship, I had published 10 papers in peer-reviewed archival journals on topics of infrastructure protection, on topics of cybersecurity, systems engineering, and I had engaged in some other research relating to supply chains, relating to standards and measurement of cybersecurity, and it set me up so that when I left the University of Virginia and joined the MITRE Corporation about 2 years ago, I was able to navigate these problems and understand how to bring a systems engineering and a multidisciplined perspective to a problem that was traditionally owned by the computer programmers and the software developers. I was able to understand and recognize, as I was appointed to be the project lead for the work that MITRE is doing to support DHS, Cybersecurity and Communications, their Supply Chain Risk Management Program Office, which is the supply chain that was on the very right of the very right column that we saw earlier. It allowed me to understand that some of these problems are not problems of our fabrication systems alone. They're not problems of our transportation systems alone. Some of these problems stem from the way that DHS is organizing their systems engineering and acquisition processes. Some of these problems in cybersecurity and in supply chain risk start very early when they're beginning to conceptualize ideas, when they're beginning to design how they are going to acquire a system, where they're going to get information from, how they're going to bring together subject matter expertise so that they can write these requirements. Some of these problems are starting in these early phases, and I'm now I have this opportunity to influence and impact these systems engineering, multidisciplined issues that I didn't think I would have been able to. So I3P has had a big impact on me personally. It's had a big impact on my career, moved me from studying risk analysis to studying cybersecurity and being able to have an impact in the space. So thank you for inviting me to share these stories, and I guess I'll turn it over to the next person.
Thank you for having me here today. My name is Sean Peisert. Everybody starts their careers in so many different ways. We've already heard of so many from today. I did all three of my degrees in computer science at UC San Diego. Tony Strumella mentioned one of the cool pieces of research this morning that came out of UCSD on hacking cars remotely. There's been some other research in recent years on tracking the spam campaign and discovering that 95% of all of the scams out there go through 3 merchant accounts in foreign countries. Unfortunately, all of that was after I was really looking for a dissertation topic. But there was some other cool stuff that had predated me a little bit that inspired me. Turns out that in the mid-90s, there was some incidents going on at UC San Diego. Now, while I was there as well, I was also working at the San Diego Supercomputer Center. Turns out that in the mid-90s, there was a guy named Kevin Mitnick who broke into some computer systems at the San Diego Supercomputer Center. And there was a guy named Satomu Shimamura who was working there, and there was a graduate student named Andrew Gross who was both working at the San Diego Supercomputer Center as well as doing his PhD. And I thought that this was fascinating and extremely cool stuff. I mean, this was really neat. CSI wasn't on the air or anything then. This was spycraft, it seemed to me. So I started looking into things, but I noticed at the time, there's something interesting about the way they're going about this. They're doing some forensics to try and track these guys down, but they're basically taking the information that's there and saying, oh my God, let's look at this pile of forensic data. What can we do with this? And I thought that I wanted to ask a slightly different question. I wanted to say, these are the things we care about. What do we need to collect in order to be able to analyze that? And this sort of started me down a path of research. Now, I was inspired, as I say, by Andrew Gross's work, having done this investigation. It turns out I dug up a copy of his dissertation and looked at his committee, and hey, there's this guy named Matt Bishop who was on his committee. Matt Bishop is a professor at UC Davis. He's the I3P rep from UC Davis, and I tracked him down at a conference and started talking to him a bit, and we hit it off, and he started informally mentoring me a little bit. And sooner or later, as I got towards the end of my dissertation, I'm trying to figure out exactly what I'm going to be doing next. He said, hey, why don't you apply for an I3P fellowship? And I confess I didn't know much about the I3P at that time, but I certainly did my homework on them and learned that my interests and goals were very much in line with theirs as well. And so I decided to apply for it, and I won a fellowship. It was amazing. And I have to say this was not just kind of a little thing that happened, and I don't think I told Matt this at the time, but I did later. I think that probably the only thing that I actually wanted to do at that point was to keep working with Matt Bishop, and so I got that opportunity, and that was amazing thing number one to happen. Amazing thing number two was that I was able to continue and extend my research. And a lot of the things that I was doing at that point during the fellowship have actually formed the underpinnings of a lot of the things that I am still doing to this date. I was working on a process of trying to reverse engineer policies, and therefore it got me into policy modeling. It got me into trying to understand the way people work. It got me into understanding what good policies and bad policies are, and trade-offs and all kinds of things that have trickled into my work, which now spans electronic voting and smart grids and control system security and data sanitization and all sorts of things. Another thing that happened, though, is, universities, unless you're a regular faculty member, aren't necessarily all that good at supporting adults, shall we say. And so I, as opposed to graduate students, and I did want to, have a real job at some point. So I started thinking about my next steps. Where to think about next steps? Well, there's I3P, right? Okay, so let's go through the list here. Berkeley Lab is just down the road from me, and there's been a bunch of cool work going on at Berkeley Lab. They're also part of University of California. I met Deba Agarwal, who is in fact the I3P rep from Berkeley Lab and has been from a number of years, and she got quite interested in my work as well. Lo and behold, I got a job there, and am now, as I have been for the last several years, jointly appointed between UC Davis and Lawrence Berkeley. A couple of other things came around at that time roughly as well. One of the things that people have mentioned up here previously as well that is so interesting about I3P, and perhaps even something that I3P and its connection started, has been this very cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary element to computer security. It took a lot of folks in the community a long time to realize that this isn't just a technological problem. But that's something that I certainly started learning, and it was in fact probably through the I3P meetings that I attended, not least of which the one where I came and presented my own fellowship work, where I really started hearing about all this economics of security, all of this issues of usability, all of these issues of psychology and sociology. And to this day, I now go seek out people in my social sciences department at UC Davis to work with, because they bring something that I don't even comprehend. I'm a computer scientist. I don't understand people. And so, and that was thing number two. It's opened my eyes to all of the new things that I need to learn about in order to do my job well, because it's not just technology alone. That only gets us so far. Another interesting thing came along as well. I realized at some point that I like doing work collaboratively, colleagues, peers, and so on. It turns out that I really got into teaching and mentoring as well. So it turned out that sometime in 2009, we were graduating an extraordinarily talented graduate student at UC Davis named Sean Whalen. And Matt Bishop and I encouraged him to apply for an I3P fellowship, which he won as well. And I had the privilege for a year of mentoring Sean Whalen as an I3P fellow as well, which was a tremendous experience. And now he's going off and doing amazing things. Actually, he went to go work with Stolfo for a while, and now is in fact just taken a job at Mount Sinai in a School of Medicine, and is exploring all sorts of amazing things. And that was a tremendous privilege, and I certainly would love to do that sort of thing again as well in the future. I really have the I3P to thank for a lot of things. It's about where I am in life right now. I have this perfect job that I'm absolutely loving. I have amazing collaborators. One of my closest colleagues and friends is Matt Bishop, and the people I've met at Davis and now at the Berkeley Lab as well. I've met other amazing people through the IP as well. Shari, who I didn't know before, but we're going to try and do some amazing things together as well, and Miles and David and many others who have become friends over the years, and that's been tremendous. Opening my eyes to what security is and isn't about is another tremendous element in terms of the cross-disciplinary elements, and that's brought in even more collaborations. And of course, just the whole element of the consortium-driven world. We live in insular little silos at some point, often in our own little university departments, and that's not what this organization is about. And so it's opened my eyes in that regard as well. And so thank you to the I3P for so many things in my life.
Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Sanders from the University of Illinois, and I'd like to also give you a few personal reflections. I guess I'm the wrap-up speaker, so we're doing okay, but I'll stay on time as well. My interaction with I3P started quite early. In fact, due to the miracle of keeping every email you send, I don't keep every email I receive, I was able to go back and look, and it was early in July of 2002 when David Nickel emailed me and he said, we're starting this new organization. The organization is related to infrastructures. I knew George. George was a big part of it. And I said, would you come to a meeting? In fact, it was a meeting on July 22 in 2002. And a big group of us got together. And I don't know if it was the first meeting of I3P. I think it was after the series of workshops that Rand had put together. But we got together and we talked about what the important things were. And as Shari, as you said, I like those word clouds you put together. I think it was at that time and together with some National Research Council reports that had come out and that suggested that critical infrastructures were an important thing to look at. And so we started looking at those. And I think that was the beginning of a long history of things that went on. I should just mention that David also, David and George together and were very key people in putting this together. They were the PIs and co-PIs of the original two major grants that came from the Justice Department that were the funding for I3P, about $28 million that came together, or maybe more than that, I guess, but that enabled all this work. So we should be thankful to them as well. David also served as the acting director in 2003 before I convinced him to move and become a faculty member at University of Illinois. So I guess we can thank I3P for that as well. It was about the same time, and in fact, the same time that David came to Illinois, that we founded the Information Trust Institute at the University of Illinois. That was, depending on how you count it, 2003 or early 2004. And I have to say that a lot of the thoughts, Information Trust Institute at the University of Illinois is a organization that takes a very broad view of trust and security. And in fact, the ideas of looking very broadly at information, the ideas, in fact, we were very deliberate in the choice of the word trust rather than security to look very holistically at the properties these systems have to have. And the ideas of taking a very high-level, top-down systems point of view, where we looked at what we were trying to achieve, what kind of systems we could impact. A lot of that was inspired by these early discussions by other people at the I3P, and I think that was very important. If we move on and we look at University of Illinois and ITI's involvement in I3P, there was a phase where we were very involved in a lot of the projects that Shari overviewed. The one I was involved in personally, and I think I'll get to the impact that had afterwards, was first the SCADA project and then the follow-on project on process control systems. There were two people I think that were very influential, Ron Trelew and then Rob Cunningham that led those projects. And several of you here, and Michael was someone I knew worked closely with on that. I think those were projects that were quite unique at the time in that they brought together academics, they brought together people from the national labs, they brought together people from the other major government-funded organizations to work together. And it wasn't just about ivory tower research, but it was how are we going to do some fundamental things, but do fundamental things in which we can really have an impact? And I think that mindset, and in fact, when Doug Mon was involved in the I3P and really promoting it, looking at how we can have an impact with what we do. And I think that was, again, very important in shaping a way of doing research that wasn't always the way that academics did research. The particular project that I was involved with within that SCADA and then process control environment was, and jointly with David Nickel, was to create something called the Access Policy Tool. And what we understood, and actually this was motivated from some DARPA work I had done a few years earlier in a different context, but that although people are building very complex infrastructure to support these process control networks, many times the networks that support those, and these networks, by the way, are very large. These networks might contain 50 to 150 firewalls. They may contain double or triple that in the number of networks that the firewalls have in them. These networks, it's very hard to get the security policy correct. And in fact, so as all those firewalls have written local policy in them, the big question is, are they implementing the right global policy? And in fact, this became a very important question in 2005 when Congress passed a bill that prescribed financial penalties for incorrect configuration of those networks. And so Access Policy Tool at the time was a tool that looked at how to use proof techniques to determine whether those kinds of policies really were met or not. And again, I'll get back to this at the end, but that really changed something that was a manual task that probably couldn't be done properly, into something that you, in a sense, will have proofs about whether you're following the rules or not. And I think that was very important. University of Illinois was also involved in the project on identity management. And in fact, Carl Gunter was a key person in that. And they were looking at federation issues in identity management. And in particular, they were looking at applications in the medical domain. And again, that's led to additional work at Illinois that I'll get to in a minute. I think another important aspect of I3P and its role at Illinois was the funding of fellowships. And I don't know that I need to say too much, because I think we've heard from 3 of the fellowship winners and how it affected their life. But there have been 2 fellowship recipients at Illinois as well. Kazuhiro Manami was the first. He worked on something called distributed authorization in virtual organizations. And in addition to that very fundamental work he did for I3P, he got involved in a large NSF-funded center that we had on cybersecurity for the power grid, and in fact stayed with us 3 years after the I3P fellowship ended, working on that center and really applying some of this work on authorization in the power grid setting. So again, I think it was important that you see that we're educating people that work in very tangible application areas, right? They're making an impact in an area, but what they do is more fundamental, so they can cross over to a new area. The second fellow that we had at Illinois was Sashir Nagaraja. I can never pronounce his last name. He was there from 2009 to 2010. And he worked on 2 things. The first topic was the strengths and limitations of subversive networks. So these are networks that are used in countries perhaps by dissidents. And he was looking at issues of anonymization, issues of availability to be able to make that communication possible. And without going into the details, some of this work, both that he started before he came to Illinois in this fellowship with Ross Anderson, and then afterwards while he was there, had some very important media impact. He also worked on botnet defenses, and we know that botnets have become something that's been very important to learn how to defend against. He was able to, using some graph theoretic techniques, look at ways to automatically, based on traffic analysis, and identify botnets, and this is a step, of course, to preventing them. I'd like to now sort of move forward to today and tell you a little bit about what we're doing now, and again, look back and see how these things I've told you about from I3P really impact that. The Access Policy Tool that was first funded by the two process control projects within I3P continued. It was continued funding through first an NSF Cybersecurity Center for the Power Grid, and then a current center that we have funded by both DOE and DHS, looking at cybersecurity for the power grid. And through the sort of foresight of the project at I3P, but then the continued funding by these other fundings, that now is a project that's being commercialized. In fact, a couple of the other speakers mentioned that there's a DHS kickoff meeting going on, and we'll be kicking off a project there that will actually commercialize that tool and make it available very widely. There are already intense use in a sort of beta sense, but for real audits that are prescribed by these laws that I talked to you about by somewhere between 20 and 30 organizations, both on the auditor side and on the utility side. And so we're seeing a very early technology that funded PhD work that was funded by I3P is going to have a fairly major commercial impact now. So there's you know, the users include people such as well, I3P people such as Sandia and PNL. They include 4 NERC regional reliability operators, which are the people that actually do the audits. They include both a pretty big set now of both large investor-owned utilities and a whole set of small electric cooperatives that just wouldn't be able to do these kind of analyses without this code. I think we can also see a parallel in the development of the I3P work and the work that's gone on in the Information Trust Institute at the University of Illinois. First, because David moved to Illinois, I was able to convince him to be the director rather than me, so I'm thankful for I3P to that, and he's leading that organization now. But also, sometimes in parallel and sometimes as a result of there have been 2 major centers on power grid security at the University of Illinois. Carl Gunter, who worked on the I3P project on identity management, now leads the Health and Human Services major security, IT security for healthcare center. That's a center that involves, I forget, 12 or 13 different universities, a $15 million center that, again, broadens and encompasses some of that original work that's been done. And then some of the fundamental ideas and sort of taking a fairly scientific approach to security and trying to, if you will, as my colleague Shung Mine would say at Dartmouth, changing from a craft of security to a science of security has led to a science of security center that we have at Illinois. So you know, it's been an interesting 10 years, and as I said, as I prepared for this, I went through a really long email log to understand and look back at what had been done. But it's clear that both on the research side that I told you, and on the education side through some of the fellows, and it was great to hear the stories of the other fellows that I3P has been really impactful. So I'd like to close and turn it over to Shari, and thank you all for listening.
Thanks again to all of you for your stories. They're wonderful.